So in 1969, in an annual report, J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI director at the time, stated, and I quote, "The Black Panther Party is the most dangerous internal threat facing this country." So when you hear that statement, what do you think? How do you feel? What comes to mind? And so today I'm going to be answering two questions. First, are his statements legitimate? And in this case, legitimacy means, is he making a statement by the rules of the game? And then second, we're going to be asking ourselves, are his statements justified? So in order to answer both of those questions, what we're going to do today is we're going to be exploring what ethnic conflict is and how does it look throughout the world and what are the consequences of that. And hopefully, upon exploring that, we're going to get a better idea of how to move the needle forward and if we are going to combat racism or injustice, we need to be very specific and target certain things in order to get the results that we're looking for. So in order to talk about ethnic conflict, first we have to understand ethnicity. So in order to understand what ethnicity means, let me start off by saying what ethnicity does not mean minority, does not mean exotic, it does not mean race. It has nothing to do with physical features. Stephen Vera, who wrote the article Primordialism Lives, he explores ethnicity in greater detail, and his definition is a shared common language. And so when language becomes codified in written form, it then cements and becomes hardened, and language is the binding point of what ethnic groups are. For example, an ethnic group that was formed in the 18th century would be the French citizen. So within France, in the Napoleonic era, before there was public education, there was different dialects of French being spoken, and so you had different peasants belonging to different serfdoms, and they saw themselves all differently until French was codified and we're going to speak one version of French altogether, was the Frenchmen born. This is the transition from feudalism into liberalism. The component of ethnicity are groups who are hardened or fragmented by a shared history or shared conflict. Non-immigrants have a more fixed ethnic identity than immigrants. An example of that within North America would be the Quebecois. They're not going to be very quick to assimilate or change their being in order to exist with greater society. And the same thing with Native Americans, as opposed to someone who leaves their home country and comes to North America and are quick to adopt the same values and the same languages in order to coexist within that society. The reason why it's important to talk about ethnic conflicts is because they are the bloodiest and the most deadly form of conflicts that can exist within international relations. So unlike wars between two states where maybe geographically they're far apart or they share a border, so once that happens, the conflict can end. Or a civil war on an ideological basis, like North or South Korea, where it's all ideology. So if I change my mind and change my beliefs, my conformity to one group or the other is fluid. I can move back and forth. With ethnic conflicts, whether you agree with it or not, people draw a line in the sand based off ethnicity, and if one group tries to fight the other, they can put you into their camp and attack you anyways. And what tends to happen is ethnic conflicts, once they start, they don't stop. They take decades to resolve. And in relation to the United States, it's important to understand that technically speaking, there hasn't ever been an ethnic conflict within the United States, because when we look at the evidence, all ethnic conflicts end in certain ways. Fortunately enough, it hasn't escalated to that point. It's very important for every single one of us, whether we're black, white, or whatever our background, to do everything in our power to avoid an ethnic conflict from ever progressing, because it affects everybody. A few examples of ethnic conflict that have happened in different parts of the world would be India and Pakistan. In the 1940s, there was a lot of conflict between Islamic practicing people and Hindu practicing people. They butchered each other. And what ended is that they rounded up all the Islamic followers, they pushed them out of India, forced them into Pakistan. So they forcibly had to create a new country and new borders. And to this day, they're two separate countries. They used to be one, and this is an example of an ethnic conflict that ruined a lot of people's lives and forced them away from their home. Another example would be the island of Cyprus. There's Greeks and there's Turks. Even though their ethnicity belongs to Greek and Turkey, they're not citizens of each of their respective country, so they have their differences. And so an ethnic conflict sparked when the Greek military said, we're going to take over the island of Cyprus, and failed. The Turkish military came to combat that, and so when the Greek military left, the Turkish military stayed. As a result, the UN had to come in and create what's called the Green Line. And what many people don't know is the island of Cyprus is two countries, one that's recognized by the UN and the EU and one that's not. So you have the Turkish Republic of Cyprus that many people don't know about. But to this very day, on the Green Line dividing north and south, there's UN soldiers that have to mitigate that violence. There's not a physical conflict, that threat or a security dilemma exists to this day, and there's no end in sight. Bosnia, Serbia, and Croatia on religious grounds. Northern and Southern Ireland, racially they look the same in terms of white. One practices Catholicism and the other one practices Protestantism within the rest of the UK. So on the outside, they're not very small differences. It's so important to highlight that if we don't handle this problem effectively, doesn't matter the smallest differences, it can escalate to irreparable consequences. We don't want that to happen within the context of the United States or North America. And if we don't smarten up or act, that's the threat that we face. Like, why I'm using the term ethnicity and not race is because race is a socially constructed way to designate people. For example, within the United States of America, to be considered black, by definition, all you need is one drop of Negroid blood, and that makes you 100% black. As compared to South Africa, where prior to 2003, you had to belong to a certain tribe in order to claim black status. You had white and you had color. There were people like myself who were of mixed background. So rather than being considered biracial, they're colored. They were actually on the lowest end of the totem pole in that society and received the least privileges and benefits because technically colored people were illegal. They weren't even allowed to exist. Same country, South Africa, in 2003, they listed the Black Empowerment Act, which included black, colored, Indian people born with South African citizenship prior to 1994. Now, legally, you're black. That gives you more rights and privileges because you have that status of black. A final example, I mentioned the Haitian revolutions in my last video. So in that revolution, there were allies who were Polish and German, and the Haitians overthrew the French government and claimed their sovereignty. Because they had allies who were European, they made the official race of the country black. But or not, they dubbed those Germans and those Polish people, our allies, you're officially black. So you are black. Using race to move this discussion forward, it's not accurate. The idea of black means different things depending on the context of the world. But what's universal is ethnicity. Do you share the same language? Do you share the same religion? Do you share the same cultures? Are they cemented? Do you have a shared common heritage? Those things are less negotiable. I can change someone's race with a piece of legislation. Just W, red, yellow, blue, doesn't matter. That's why race isn't going to be useful for us in this discussion today. Backtracking towards ethnic conflict. The reason why they're so deadly, there's two different ways to which you look at it. One way is how do we eliminate ethnic conflict? Two, how do we manage it? Right now, within the context of the United States, they've been managing ethnic differences for some time, and the way that they have been managing it would be one specific example, which would be hegemonic control. So you have a group of people who have absolute control over the state and how those things are managed. We're going to look at the history and we're going to see several pieces of injustice. As a result of that injustice, what's the consequence? Escalation. Great news is there's no outright ethnic conflict that's happened throughout US history. That's good, and that's the last thing we ever want. Eliminating ethnic conflict has four distinct outcomes. Outcome number one, forced mass population transfers. That means that whatever your ethnicity is, or whatever camp you decide on, we're just going to round you up. We're going to move you out of the country. Like, as people lose their homes, people get separated from family, people lose their jobs, you're arbitrarily being picked up, rounded up, and moved out. Second one is called partition, which is, again, adds to forced mass population transfer, whereas we're going to pick you up and move you up, but we're going to force you into a new place, and that's going to be a country. This would be the example of Pakistan. That was a partition. Secession. Secession is similar to partition, except in this case, it's self-deterministic. An example of that would be Quebec trying to establish its own country. They're not being forced and round out of Canada. The ethnic French-speaking people, francophones, want to leave Canada on their own. And that's not healthy for anybody either. The third is integration and assimilation. So this is something that happens in a lot of liberal democracies. So you have an immigrant group coming in and they just integrate into that belief system, into that ethnic group. and they just coexist or they assimilate. This was a project that happened to Native Americans unsuccessfully with the residential schools, where their culture or their ethnicity or their group is being bleached out, being forced out of them in order to them to be a part of the Canadian project or the American project. Now, this is essentially what Martin Luther King strove for. And I'll talk more about the African American experience unique, based off of the hegemonic control and how they've been managing it, and based off the police brutality, and based off of the constitutional amendments that are currently in place right now, which we'll talk about. It's insufficient. And I'll explain why. Because it's insufficient and we are at threat of this increased escalation, the scariest outcome of them all is genocide, which is we are going to indiscriminately kill off every single member of that ethnic group. One can make the argument that on top of the way that ethnic conflicts being managed within the United States, the underlying agenda is genocide. And that's maybe a conversation for a different day, but let us examine the evidence. Going back to our intro, when I asked, are J. Edgar Hoover's statements legitimate? Do they play by the rules? And yes, they do. From the framework of international relations, from the realistic perspective, the most dangerous thing to a state's sovereignty is mismanaging ethnic conflict in different ethnic groups. If the Black Panther Party, from a geopolitical perspective, serve as a threat on ethnic guidelines within the United States, 100% his statements are legitimate for two reasons. One, in international relations, there's a perspective called zero sum. It's winner take all. So if I lose one thing, I lose everything. J. Edgar Hoover, being in a position of authority, especially on a federal level, is speaking from that perspective. And then the second thing that he's commenting on, it's called a security dilemma. Now, in all my past examples, all of those countries were under, the influence of what's called a security dilemma. Different ethnic groups, once they split up or the conflict happens, they don't reemerge, is because there's this increased threat. So as one group gets more power, more esteem, it threatens the very existence and sovereignty of the other group. J. Edgar Hoover is playing by the rules of the game when he says, based off of, Black Panther, they're trying to mobilize themselves. It causes us to potentially lose everything. And then throughout history, there's this increased status, and that causes a security dilemma. So to best understand the security dilemma without giving you like the full definition and the breakdown, it's just think of it as a spiral. So as one group, no matter what part of the country or what part of the world, continues to improve, different competing groups continue to spiral closer and closer and closer and closer and closer towards conflict. Going back, J. Edgar Hoover's statements are legitimate from that framework. And so for that reason, we're going to re-examine everything we just talked about from a different lens, and I'm going to explain to you why his statements are unjust.